Good afternoon. I'm glad you could join us tonight. I'm rocking my new youth minister shirt that Joe gave me. We're matching today, so I feel a little more official today than normal. I want to start off by talking about, have you ever had somebody that treats you poorly or does you wrong? I'm sure that you have, because we all have people who have done that to us in our lifetime. At some point, somebody's going to do something that's going to hurt your feelings or treat you disrespectfully. And if you're like me, it's going to make you mad. It's going to make you upset. And it definitely applies to me. Trust me. But how are we supposed to handle things like this? How are we supposed to handle this in a Christ-like manner? What am I going to do if somebody doesn't treat me right? I think it's awesome that every time we have an issue or we have a question, we can look at Scripture, and Scripture always gives us an answer and steers us in the right direction. So let's do that today. Let's read a story, one of my favorites, in Luke chapter 15. I'm going to start at verse 11 and go through 24. It's called the Parable of the Lost Son. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast to celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate." This is a classic story of forgiveness that we find in Scripture. This son asked for his inheritance early. So if you don't know anything about an inheritance is generally given whenever somebody has passed away or somebody, dies and they leave something to somebody. So essentially this son goes to his dad and says, "Dad, I wish you were dead so I could get my money and my stuff," which would have been a low blow. That would have hurt. How hurtful would it have been for a child to come up to you and say that, your own child that you loved? Then he goes and he proceeds to just blow this money on living, wild. He was living it up and partying and doing all sorts of sinful things, and blew all his money. And it got to the point where he actually had to feed pigs for a living, which is an unclean animal to the Jews. So this would have been a very degrading, very last resort job for him. So it must have been really hard times. As a matter of fact, it even talks about how he wanted to eat the pig's slop. He was so hungry. So it must have been really bad. When he decides to come home, though, I'd say that he was expecting in his head for his father to be upset with him, but his dad sees him coming on the horizon and is so excited that he takes off running to him. He goes to him. He doesn't let him come to him, but he goes to him and runs to him and hugs him and kisses him, and he throws this huge party to celebrate that he's come home. Now, when I think about this, I think about, one day I'd like to be a father, and I wonder, could I do that? If my son treated me like that, if he did that to me, could I do that to him? It would have been very difficult, How much forgiveness would this guy have had to have? How much love would he had to have had in his heart to forgive his son completely and just go on and be happy and feast? Let's read some more Scripture. Let's look at another example. This one's coming from Luke chapter 22, verses 54 through 62. This one is titled, Peter Disowns Jesus. says, then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. He's talking about Jesus there. Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, this man was with him, meaning Jesus. But he denied it. Woman, I don't know him, he said. A little while later, someone else saw him and said, you also are one of them. Man, I am not, Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean. Peter replied, man, I do not know what you're talking about. Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Here's another example of someone doing someone wrong. Only this time we're talking about Jesus is the one that's being done wrong here. You know, imagine being Peter. You've been there. You've seen Jesus walk on water. You've seen a dead man raised. You've been there through it all. And yet, Peter denies Jesus 3 separate times on this night. He must have been really scared. Jesus knew that Peter was going to do this. Jesus predicted it. He told him that before the rooster crowed, that you will deny me 3 times. He predicted it, and yet Jesus still forgave him. Jesus goes on to reinstate him and bring him back in. But Jesus even knew that Peter was going to do him wrong and was already ready to forgive him. Let's read about that. It's in John chapter 21, verses 15 through 17. It's titled, Jesus Reinstates Peter. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The 3rd time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time. Do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Peter denied that he ever even knew who Jesus was. He said, I don't know who that is. Right as soon as Jesus was being betrayed and was about to go to Calvary and hang on that cross. And yet Jesus knew, and Jesus still forgave. Jesus forgave someone who said that he didn't know him, ever. And I can't imagine how much love and how much forgiveness Jesus would have had here to have forgave Peter. You know, I'm going to tell you that people treating you poorly is part of life. It's going to happen. You can't control that. But what you can control is how you react. In the past, I've let it ruin my mood daily. I've hung on to it. I've wanted revenge. I've held grudges. I've let it control me. I've handled it the human way. We as humans, someone does us wrong, we want to do them back wrong. That's just our nature. But this is not the right way to handle these things. You know, never in the Bible have I ever read Jesus say, you know, if he hits you, you hit him back. That's never what Jesus said. It's never what he taught. Jesus taught to forgive and forget, and that's what we should do. Let's read one more little thing of Scripture. Matthew 18, 21 through 22. It says, Then Peter came to Jesus, and he asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. You know, Jesus he doesn't mince words here, you know. He tells it like it is. Peter comes up to him and says, you know, 7 times I should probably forgive my brother, and then after that, I shouldn't forgive him, right? And Jesus says, no, that's not right at all. 77 times. Not 7 times, not 77 times, 70 times 7. If you're at home breaking out your calculator right now, that's 490. It was a very large amount. And, you know, Jesus doesn't mean to sit there and put a tally mark every time somebody does you something wrong and you forgive them up to 490. It was just such a large number that he means that we should always forgive. We should always forget and move on. And I'm going to tell you from personal experience that when I decide to let go of grudges, whenever I decided to let go of hate, whenever I decided to let go of wanting revenge, my life became much more enjoyable. It's a much more enjoyable life to live whenever you're not always upset with someone and trying to want to get back at someone, and when you just sit down and forgive and then forget about it. You know, I'd say that right now you can probably think of somebody who you're upset with or who's done you wrong. I think we all can, to be honest with you. But there's no better time than right now to go on and forgive that person, to let go of carrying that burden and just give it to Jesus and lay it down at Jesus' feet and go on and live your life without it. It'll make your burdens a lot easier. It'll make life a lot easier for you if we follow what Jesus says here. I hope this applies to your life and it helps you in some way, shape, or form or fashion. And until next time, we'll see you.